I never thought at 65 I'd be packing my life into cardboard boxes again. After my husband passed away 5 years earlier, the house we had built together felt too big, too quiet, too full of echoes I wasn't ready to confront. Selling it had been a bittersweet decision, one I made more out of practicality than desire. I told myself it was time to simplify, to let go. Daniel, my only son, had been the first to suggest I move in with him and his wife, Emily. I remember the phone call as clearly as if it happened yesterday. His voice was warm, almost boyish, the way it used to be when he was younger. "Mom, you've done so much for us. This house will always be your home, too. Come stay with us. It'll be easier for everyone." Emily chimed in on speakerphone, her tone sugary sweet. "You'll have your own room, Margaret, and the kids will love having their grandmother close. Think of it as expanding our family time." They painted a picture so inviting. Sunday breakfasts together, shared holidays, me reading bedtime stories to my grandkids. I wanted to believe every word. After years of living alone, the thought of being surrounded by family again felt like a balm. The day I moved in, Emily greeted me with fresh flowers in my room, the children bouncing with excitement at my arrival. Daniel carried in the last of my boxes, grinning as he said, "Welcome home, Mom. This place is yours just as much as it is ours." My heart swelled at those words. In those first few weeks, life felt almost perfect. The morning started with the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I'd help get the kids ready for school, packing lunches while Emily handled breakfast. Daniel would kiss me on the cheek before heading to work, thanking me for keeping everything running smoothly. Afternoons were my favorite. I'd pick the kids up from school and listen to them chatter about their day. We'd bake cookies together or work on their homework at the dining room table. Emily would sometimes join us, offering polite smiles as she passed through. Evenings were family time. I'd cook dinner, nothing fancy, just hearty meals like roast chicken, lasagna, or my late husband's favorite beef stew. Daniel would rave about the food, Emily complimenting my old-fashioned recipes. After dinner, we'd gather in the living room, kids on the floor playing board games while the adults chatted. For a while, it felt like I'd stepped into the kind of family harmony I'd always wanted for my later years. I had purpose again, not just as a grandmother, but as a part of the household. My presence seemed welcomed, even celebrated. There were little moments that reinforced this belief. On my birthday, they threw a small party, the kids presenting me with a cake they'd helped decorate. Emily handed me a card with a gift card tucked inside. Daniel toasted to the most selfless mother anyone could ask for. My heart swelled with gratitude. We even began creating new traditions. Saturday mornings became pancake day, with the kids insisting I make them the way I used to make for Daniel when he was young. Sunday afternoons were for family walks in the park. I felt woven into the fabric of their lives, not as a guest, but as a cornerstone of the family home. In those days, I told myself I'd made the right choice. I'd traded the silence of an empty house for the warmth of laughter, shared meals, and the patter of little feet running down the hallway. Daniel and Emily's home, our home, was filled with life, and I was grateful to be part of it. I kept my own life simple. I didn't bring much from my old house except the essentials: clothes, a few pieces of furniture, some books, and a box of family photographs. Emily had decorated the guest room for me with fresh bedding and curtains. It wasn't the master bedroom I'd once had, but it was cozy, bright, and comfortable. Every time I walked into the kitchen and saw the kids perched on the counter helping me bake, or when Daniel would sit with me in the evenings sharing work stories, I felt that old ache of loneliness fade. I thought maybe this was what my husband would have wanted, to see me cared for, surrounded by family, instead of rattling around alone in that big, empty house. Looking back, I realize now how eager I was to believe in that picture-perfect life. At the time, though, I had no reason to doubt it. Daniel seemed happy to have me there. Emily was polite, if a bit distant at times, and the children were a constant source of joy. In those early days, I didn't notice the small details that would later gnaw at me. The way Emily would sometimes tense when I rearranged the spice rack, or how Daniel would change the subject when I asked about household decisions. Back then, I brushed off those moments as nothing more than quirks of cohabitation. For now, I was just content. I had traded solitude for connection, my savings for security. I told myself this was my home as much as theirs. And as I watched my grandchildren laugh and play in the living room, I believed with all my heart that I truly belonged here. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Small changes, subtle ones that didn't seem worth making a fuss about. The kind of adjustments anyone might expect when sharing a home. It began one Saturday morning when I went into the kitchen early to start breakfast. I had always been an early riser, and I loved the quiet of the house before everyone woke up. But as I reached for the coffee pot, Emily appeared in the doorway. Her tone was light, but there was something calculated in her smile. "Oh, Margaret, I've been meaning to mention. Daniel and I are trying to make mornings a bit more organized. I'll handle the breakfast prep from now on, just so the kitchen isn't crowded." I hesitated, feeling the sting beneath her polite words. "Of course," I replied with a smile, telling myself it was nothing. It was her kitchen, after all. A few days later, I noticed a small list taped discreetly to the fridge. "Family guidelines," it read in Emily's looping handwriting. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Keep shared spaces tidy, respect everyone's schedules, use TV time fairly. But as I read down the list, I realized the examples given were aimed at me. No personal items left in the living room meant I couldn't keep my knitting basket by the sofa anymore. TV reserved for children's programming in the afternoon meant I could no longer watch my favorite shows while I waited for them to come home from school. When I asked Daniel about it, he gave a sheepish laugh. "It's just to keep things running smoothly, Mom. You know how kids are. They need structure." His words were gentle, but they left me feeling unsettled. I wasn't a guest. This was supposed to be my home, too. Yet suddenly there were rules. Rules I hadn't agreed to, limiting what I could do in the place I lived. It didn't stop there. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Emily came in with a polite smile. "Margaret, I know you love spending time here, but Daniel and I were thinking it might be nice if the living room stayed more open, just so it's ready for when we have guests over." I knew what she meant. She didn't want me in there as much. She didn't want signs of my presence, my books, my projects, my very existence, in the space she considered hers. Daniel, sitting nearby, said nothing. He nodded in agreement with his wife, glancing at me with a faint apologetic smile as though hoping I'd understand without forcing him to say more. I told myself again not to overreact. They were a young couple managing a busy household. Maybe they just needed more space. But each change was like a pebble dropped in water, the ripples growing until I could no longer ignore them. I began to notice other things, too. My seat at the dining table was shifted further down, closer to the end. The photos in the hallway, which once included pictures of me with Daniel and the children, were gradually replaced with more recent shots of just their little family. It wasn't that I was excluded outright. There was never anything overt. No shouting, no arguments. But the feeling was there, woven into the fabric of daily life. I was no longer part of the center. I was orbiting around it. Even the children, though still affectionate, seemed to pick up on subtle cues. They'd knock before entering my room now, something they'd never done before. When I asked Emily about it, she said cheerfully, "We're just teaching them to respect boundaries." Boundaries, rules, guidelines. All the polite words in the world couldn't mask what I was beginning to feel. I was a visitor in my own home. I tried to speak to Daniel one evening while Emily was out. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us, like we used to when he was younger. I told him I was feeling a little out of place, that the new rules made me feel like I was intruding. He reached over, patted my hand, and said, "Mom, you're reading too much into it. Emily just likes to keep things organized. This is still your home." but his words felt rehearsed, the same way someone might reassure a child while sidestepping the truth. I looked into his eyes, searching for the son who once called me for advice late at night, who promised I'd always have a place in his life. All I saw was a man avoiding conflict. Over time, I adjusted. I kept my knitting in my room. I only used the kitchen when Emily wasn't around. I stopped watching TV in the afternoons. On the surface, nothing was wrong. The house was calm. Meals were shared. Smiles were exchanged. But deep inside, I began to feel the shift. I was no longer a part of the heart of this family. I was becoming what I'd never intended to be, a quiet, unobtrusive presence. Someone who lived here but didn't quite belong. And for the first time since I'd moved in, a small, uneasy thought took root in my mind. Perhaps this wasn't my home after all. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. For as long as I could remember, I had been the one hosting, setting the table with care, and filling the house with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and my famous pumpkin pie. Even after my husband passed, I had kept the tradition alive, bringing the family together every year without fail. That's why, when Daniel announced that he and Emily would be hosting Thanksgiving this year, I felt a twinge of sadness. But I told myself it was only natural. They were building their own traditions. Families grow and change, and I could adapt. Still, I asked Emily a week before the holiday if I could help with the preparations. I was met with a polite but firm smile. "Oh, Margaret, you've done enough over the years. We've got it covered. This will be a stress-free holiday for you." Her words sounded kind, but there was something final in her tone. I told myself she meant well, that maybe she wanted to take the pressure off me. Yet in my heart, I felt the faintest sting of being replaced. On the morning of Thanksgiving, I decided to bake my pumpkin pie anyway. It wasn't about control or tradition. It was about love. That pie recipe had been passed down from my mother, and it had graced our Thanksgiving table for decades. I carefully prepared it, feeling the familiar comfort of the spices in the air. When I arrived at the dining room carrying the pie, Emily's smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, you brought your pie," she said, her tone light but her eyes cool. "Well, we already have desserts, but I suppose we can set it aside." Set it aside. I felt my chest tighten, but I said nothing. I placed the pie on the counter next to the other desserts, most of which were store-bought. I couldn't help but notice it was pushed to the far end of the table, almost out of sight. Dinner began with everyone taking their seats. I expected Daniel or Emily to gesture for me to sit near them, as I always had in the past. Instead, I found my place card at the far end of the table, next to the children. I tried to smile as I sat down, telling myself that perhaps it was just a matter of convenience, that seating arrangements didn't mean anything. But the warmth I had felt in previous years seemed to be missing. The food began to make its way around the table. Plates were filled with turkey, stuffing, and mashed potatoes, laughter filling the air. I waited patiently, but by the time the serving dishes reached me, the portions were smaller, the food cooler. My plate was a pale reflection of everyone else's. I glanced down the table, noticing that no one seemed to notice or care. Emily was busy chatting with her friends who had been invited this year. Daniel was deep in conversation with his father-in-law. I tried to focus on the children, asking them about school, but even they were distracted. Their attention pulled toward the other end of the table where the laughter was loudest. When it came time for the toast, I waited for someone to acknowledge me. In years past, Daniel had always raised his glass to thank me for my hard work and love. This year, Emily stood, her smile poised. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about new traditions. My name was never mentioned. I sipped my wine quietly, a lump forming in my throat. I felt invisible, as though the years of hosting, cooking, and holding this family together had been erased in a single evening. I looked at the pie on the counter. It remained untouched. No one asked about it. No one remembered it. I told myself to stay composed. I smiled when someone glanced my way, laughed softly at the right moments, but inside, I felt hollow. By the time dessert was served, my pie was nowhere to be seen. Instead, plates of pumpkin cheesecake and pecan tarts were passed around, desserts Emily had chosen. I didn't say a word. The evening carried on, the table buzzing with energy that seemed to flow around me but never toward me. I felt like a shadow at my own family gathering. When dinner ended and guests began to drift into the living room, I helped clear the plates. Emily gave me a polite smile. "Oh, you don't have to, Margaret. We've got it." Her words, though meant to sound gracious, felt like a dismissal. I slipped into the kitchen to check on the pie. It sat exactly where I had left it, still untouched, the crust perfectly golden, the scent of cinnamon faint in the air. I looked at it for a long moment, then covered it carefully. For the first time, I wondered if this Thanksgiving would be the last I would spend in this house. The house was quieter than usual the morning after Thanksgiving. The guests were gone, the dining room cleared of decorations, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the dishwasher and the children playing upstairs. I was in the kitchen rinsing the coffee pot when I heard Emily's voice. It was light, almost cheerful, coming from the hallway near the mudroom. At first I didn't think much of it. She was always on the phone with someone. But then her words caught my attention. "Honestly, it's worked out better than I thought," she said, her voice low but audible. "Having his mom here is convenient. She keeps the kids busy, the house stays tidy, and we don't have to worry about hiring extra help." I froze, my hands stilling under the warm water. There was a pause and then a laugh. "Yeah, she's sweet, but, it's like having a live-in helper without the paycheck." Her words stung more than I could have imagined. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse thudding in my ears. Before I could move away, I heard Daniel's voice in the background. His tone was relaxed, almost amused. "Come on, Em. She likes being here. It's easier for everyone." And then he laughed. I stood there, my back rigid, my fingers gripping the edge of the sink. My son, my only child, the boy I had raised, comforted and sacrificed for, was laughing along with his wife about how convenient it was to have me under their roof. The conversation moved on to something else, their voices drifting farther away, but the damage was done. The words kept echoing in my mind. Convenient, live-in helper. Without the paycheck. I dried my hands slowly, trying to steady my breathing. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just sadness. It was a deep, hollow ache. I had come here thinking I was part of the family, that my presence mattered. But now it felt like I was only here because I was useful. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the box of photographs I'd brought from my old house. Pictures of Daniel as a boy, his first day of school, his high school graduation, the smile on his wedding day. I remembered the long nights I stayed up when he was sick, the double shifts I took to pay for his college tuition, the holidays I worked extra hours so he and Emily could have the wedding they dreamed of. All of it came rushing back, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment I'd chosen his comfort over my own. And now, here I was, overhearing him laugh about how convenient it was to have me around. The memory of Thanksgiving dinner the night before felt sharper now. The seat at the end of the table, the untouched pie, the way no one had raised a glass in my honor. It all clicked into place, like puzzle pieces I hadn't wanted to fit together. I thought about confronting them, about walking into the room and demanding to know if that was how they truly saw me. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, not because I accepted it, but because I knew my words wouldn't change what was already in their hearts. People reveal themselves when they think no one is listening. I had just heard the truth, clearer than any explanation they could give me. That night, I went through the motions as though nothing had happened. I helped Emily clean up after dinner, listened as Daniel talked about work, read the children their bedtime story. On the surface, everything looked the same. But inside, I felt different. I moved through the house more carefully now, noticing details I hadn't before. Emily's voice when she introduced me to her friends. "This is Daniel's mom. She lives with us." With the faintest emphasis on lives with us, like a polite disclaimer. The way Daniel referred to the house as our place when talking to others. Never our home, as if it were theirs alone. And I noticed myself changing too. I stopped leaving my books in the living room. I stayed out of the kitchen during Emily's designated times. I made myself smaller, quieter, easier, not because I wanted to, but because I realized my presence here wasn't built on the love and respect I thought it was. It was built on utility. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the other side of the house. I felt like I was on the outside of my own family, looking in through a window. And for the first time since moving in, I wondered how long I would stay. It was a rainy Tuesday when I stumbled upon the envelope that would change everything. Emily had taken the children to an after-school activity, and Daniel was still at work. I was alone in the house, moving through the quiet rooms with my usual habit of tidying as I went. Over the months, I'd learned to keep my presence subtle. Polished surfaces, folded laundry, dishes neatly put away. I told myself I did it to help, but deep down, I knew it was also to avoid giving anyone a reason to complain about me. As I bent down to straighten a stack of mail on the console table in the hallway, I noticed a thick envelope wedged between a magazine and a school newsletter. It was addressed to me. At first, I thought it might be a piece of forwarded mail, some old account still tied to my former address. But the return address caught my eye, the bank that had handled the sale of my old house. My chest tightened as I carefully opened it. Inside was a set of documents, statements, a cover letter, and a copy of the property deed for this house. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling as I read. My name was there, not as a co-signer, not as an emergency contact, but as the sole legal owner. I read it again, my breath catching. The purchase had been completed primarily with the proceeds from the sale of my old home, money I had put forward without hesitation when Daniel told me he had found the perfect place for the family. At the time, I hadn't cared whose name was on the paperwork. I trusted my son completely. But here it was in black and white. This house, the one I had been quietly tiptoeing around in for months, belonged to me. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. A strange mix of emotions washed over me. Surprise, confusion, and, beneath it all, the faintest glimmer of hope. I wasn't just a guest here. I wasn't someone staying on sufferance, dependent on the goodwill of my son and daughter-in-law. This was my home, legally and unequivocally. For the first time in months, my posture straightened. The weight that had been pressing on my chest seemed to lift ever so slightly. I set the papers on the coffee table and took a deep breath, letting the reality sink in. Memories from the day I signed those documents came flooding back. Daniel thanking me for making the dream possible. Emily hugging me and promising, "This will always be your home too, Margaret." I almost laughed at the irony. The very words they had once used to make me feel welcome now echoed with an entirely different meaning. I picked up the deed again, running my fingers over my name. The paper felt like more than just a legal document. It felt like a shield. It didn't erase the hurt of the last few months. It didn't undo the conversations I'd overheard or the dismissive glances across the dinner table. But it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Leverage. I tucked the envelope back into its cover and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand, hidden beneath some old greeting cards. I knew better than to confront anyone immediately. If Daniel and Emily saw me waving legal papers around, they'd only grow defensive. No, this wasn't the time to speak. This was the time to observe. Over the next few days, I watched them more carefully. I noticed how often they referred to the house as theirs when speaking to others. I paid attention to the way Emily hosted friends, proudly giving tours as if I were invisible. I noticed Daniel's quiet agreement whenever she spoke about future plans for the property. It was almost surreal, sitting there at dinner listening to them discuss renovations and upgrades, knowing that every nail and beam technically belonged to me. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I kept my expression neutral, my voice calm, but inside, there was a new current of energy. For months, I had felt powerless, like a burden waiting for the moment I would be asked to move on. Now, I realized the ground beneath my feet was far more solid than they imagined. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I pulled the deed from its hiding place once more. I ran my thumb over the embossed seal, letting the weight of it settle in my mind. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a turning point. I thought back to every sacrifice I'd made for Daniel over the years, every late bill I'd paid, every corner I'd cut to give him a better life. I thought about the holidays I'd worked overtime so he could have gifts under the tree, the vacations I never took so he could go to college, debt-free. And now, without even realizing it, I had secured my own safety. I folded the papers carefully and returned them to their envelope, placing them back in the drawer. I didn't need to announce anything. Not yet. Let them think I was still the quiet, unobtrusive presence in the corner. Let them think I was here at their mercy. They had no idea that the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the faintest spark of control returning to my life. I didn't sleep much after finding the deed. My mind kept turning over the implications, running through scenarios late into the night. By morning, I knew I needed clarity, not just from my own understanding of the document, but from someone who could tell me exactly what it meant in practical legal terms. So I made an appointment with a lawyer. It wasn't the first time I'd set foot in a law office, but it felt different now. This wasn't about estate planning or paperwork for my late husband. This was about protecting myself. The office was quiet, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. The lawyer, a calm man in his late 40s named Mr. Harris, welcomed me into a polished room lined with bookshelves. I handed him the envelope containing the property documents. He adjusted his glasses as he read, flipping slowly through each page. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he looked up. "Mrs. Walker," he said evenly, "there's no ambiguity here. You are the sole legal owner of the property. You hold full title. That means you have the right to occupy, sell, rent, or, if necessary, require anyone else to vacate." I blinked. "Even my son and his wife?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "Legally speaking, they are occupants by your consent. If that consent is withdrawn, you have every right to serve them with notice." The words settled over me like a weighted blanket. I felt both steady and unnerved. The power was mine, something I hadn't realized until now. But then, Mr. Harris hesitated. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Mrs. Walker, there's something else I should mention. Part of my due diligence is reviewing any recorded correspondence or filings related to the property. While checking the county records, I came across something unusual." He turned his monitor toward me. On the screen was a PDF copy of an email exchange linked to a request for a property value assessment. The sender's name made my stomach drop. Daniel Walker. In the email, Daniel had contacted a real estate agent 6 weeks earlier, asking for a market evaluation of the house. He wrote that they might be interested in selling within the next 6 months, once the timing is right. I stared at the words. There was no mention of me, no inquiry about my consent. It read as if he and Emily were the only decision makers. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "They were going to sell the house?" Mr. Harris nodded, his tone measured. "It appears they were making plans, without your knowledge." I sat back, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. My own son, planning to sell the house that legally belonged to me. The The same house I had paid for, the one he and his wife treated as theirs, while making me feel like an outsider. The sting of overhearing Emily's phone call after Thanksgiving came rushing back, now sharper, colder. This wasn't just about convenience or boundaries, this was about something much larger. Mr. Harris cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Walker, I want to be very clear. They cannot legally sell this property without your consent. But the fact that they're making these inquiries suggests they either don't understand or are willfully ignoring the legal reality." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to storm home, confront them both, demand an explanation. But another part of me, the part that had spent months being underestimated, knew better. If they thought I was naive, it would work to my advantage. I asked Mr. Harris what my options were. He laid them out plainly. I could revoke their right to live in the house at any time. I could serve them with a formal notice to vacate. Or I could simply wait, gathering documentation, letting them continue down their path until the moment I was ready to act. By the time I left the office, my decision wasn't set in stone, but the foundation had shifted. I wasn't powerless. And now, I had something I hadn't had in a long time, information they didn't know I had. Driving home, I replayed Daniel's laugh in my head, the one I had heard when Emily described me as convenient. I thought about the untouched pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. I thought about the seating arrangement, the rules, the polite dismissal. Each memory felt like kindling, and the truth I had just learned was the spark. When I arrived home, Emily greeted me in the kitchen, asking if I could pick up the kids later. I smiled politely and agreed, as if nothing had changed. But inside, I knew everything had changed. I went to my room, opened the drawer, and placed the lawyer's card next to the envelope with the deed. This wasn't the time to act. Not yet. For now, I would wait. Because in 6 months, when Daniel and Emily thought they'd be selling their house, they discovered just how wrong they were. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like the powerless guest in this home. I felt like the person who held all the cards. After my meeting with Mr. Harris, I couldn't stop thinking about the email Daniel had sent to the real estate agent. The idea that he and Emily were planning to sell the house behind my back wasn't just careless. It was calculated. But I needed to understand why. What could drive my own son to risk everything? So I started watching more closely. It didn't take long for me to notice small details that had slipped past me before. Daniel's phone calls in the evenings were quieter, shorter. He often stepped outside to take them, pacing in the backyard. Emily seemed more tense than usual, snapping at the children and brushing off conversations. One afternoon, while Emily was out and Daniel was upstairs, I was tidying the kitchen when I noticed a folder partially tucked under a stack of mail. The top corner bore the logo of a bank I didn't recognize. I shouldn't have looked, but something in me couldn't resist. I opened the folder just enough to see the contents, credit statements, loan notices, and an overdue payment on a line of credit. My stomach sank. Daniel was in debt, and not just a little. The amounts listed were far beyond what I thought he could handle. There were notes about payment arrangements and property liquidation as options to resolve the balance. I carefully put the papers back exactly where I found them, my mind reeling. The pieces began to fall into place. Selling the house wasn't just about moving somewhere new. It was about solving a financial problem, one they apparently thought they could fix by cashing in on a property they believed was theirs to control. But what they hadn't counted on was that the property wasn't theirs. It was mine. Over the next week, I started quietly asking questions. I spoke to a few neighbors under the pretense of catching up, and one of them mentioned that Emily had been talking about looking at bigger houses in the area. That comment stuck with me, so I decided to call my sister, Linda. She'd always been close to the family, though we hadn't spoken much lately. I told her I wanted to catch up and invited her for coffee. When she arrived, we sat at the small cafe down the street. After some polite conversation, I casually brought up the topic of Emily. Linda hesitated, glancing at her cup. Margaret, I wasn't sure if I should mention this, but a couple of months ago I ran into Emily at a charity event. She was talking to some friends about the housing market, and I overheard her say, "This house will be ours soon. We just have to figure out the timing." I felt my breath catch. She said that in those words? Linda nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I thought maybe you knew. I assumed you were all on the same page about moving." I leaned back, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. My sister's words felt like confirmation of everything I had suspected and feared. Emily hadn't just been thinking about a new house. She had been openly talking about the one we lived in as if it already belonged to her. And if she believed that, then she believed I was a temporary fixture, someone who could be shuffled aside when the time came. I thanked Linda for telling me and promised I'd keep her confidence. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't the calm of peace. It was the calm that comes when you finally see the truth clearly, no matter how much it hurts. Walking back home, I replayed everything in my mind. The Thanksgiving dinner, the overheard phone call, the seating at the table, the untouched pie. They weren't just minor slights or careless words. They were signs of a plan that had been in motion for months. And now I had proof. Daniel's debt, Emily's ambitions, their quiet assumption that the house would soon be theirs. They had underestimated me. That evening, as I sat in my room, I pulled out the deed again. My name stared back at me, a silent reminder of the leverage I held. I thought about Emily's confident voice at that charity event, about Daniel's laughter on the phone, about the hidden folder of overdue statements. They thought I was powerless, but I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the quiet, unwanted guest in their home. I felt like someone holding a secret they weren't prepared for. And as much as it hurt to know the truth, I also knew this. When the moment came, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would make sure they understood exactly who this house belonged to. I've always believed that the best moves are made quietly. You don't announce a checkmate before the king is cornered. You wait until the moment the board speaks for itself. After hearing what Linda told me about Emily, I knew there was no room left for doubt. Daniel's debts, Emily's open confidence, the unspoken rules of the house, it was all leading to one eventual conclusion. They wanted me gone, but I wasn't going anywhere. I contacted Mr. Harris again, this time not just for information, but for action. Sitting across from his desk, I explained the situation plainly, the overheard phone calls, the mounting debt, Emily's remarks. He listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he tapped his pen against the folder. "Mrs. Walker, I can prepare the necessary eviction documents. Given your legal ownership, they will be completely enforceable. The key will be timing. You'll need to decide when you want to serve them." Timing. The word stuck in my mind all the way home. Thanksgiving was only a few weeks away. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Last Thanksgiving, I had been served cold food at the end of the table, invisible in my own family's celebration. This year, I could serve something very different. I asked Mr. Harris to proceed. He promised to have everything ready in a sealed envelope within a week. At home, I slipped back into my role. I cooked dinners. I watched the kids. I stayed out of Emily's way in the kitchen. I nodded along when Daniel talked vaguely about future plans, without ever specifying what those plans entailed. I even smiled when Emily mentioned offhandedly that maybe next year we could do Thanksgiving somewhere bigger. Inside, I was steel. Outside, I was the same helpful mother they'd come to take for granted. But quietly, I began setting the stage. First, I called Linda again. I told her I was hosting a special Thanksgiving this year, just a small family gathering, nothing too elaborate. She sounded surprised but pleased. "It'll be nice to see everyone together," she said warmly. I invited my cousin Irene and her husband as well, both of whom had seen enough over the years to know when something was off. They didn't need the details, just my voice, steady and calm, was enough to secure their attendance. The idea wasn't to create a spectacle for the sake of embarrassment. It was to ensure there were witnesses, people who would see the truth for themselves, who would understand without me having to explain. Meanwhile, I kept a careful eye on the atmosphere in the house. Emily was increasingly distracted, often on her laptop or phone late into the evening. Daniel seemed tired, more withdrawn than usual. I suspected their plans were moving forward, their timeline perhaps shorter than they anticipated. Every time I overheard them whispering in the kitchen or stepping outside for private conversations, I felt more certain I was doing the right thing. A week before Thanksgiving, I picked up the envelope from Mr. Harris's office. It was heavier than I expected, not in weight but in significance. Inside were the formal eviction notices, each page signed and notarized. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it contained. I tucked it carefully into a drawer in my bedroom, alongside the deed. The house was quiet the evening I brought it home. I made dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Nothing fancy, just comfort food. As we sat at the table, I looked around at the faces of my family, the children laughing. Daniel distracted, scrolling his phone between bites. Emily chatting idly about holiday plans. They had no idea. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: control. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were a blur of preparation. I baked pies, 2 pumpkin, 1 pecan, and made my cranberry sauce from scratch. Emily seemed surprised but said nothing when I announced I'd be cooking some of the dishes this year. "It's been a while since you've had a holiday without lifting a finger, Margaret," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I don't mind," I replied lightly. "It's tradition." She didn't argue. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived cold and bright. I woke early, moving quietly through the kitchen as the smell of turkey began to fill the house. Linda and Irene arrived mid-morning, offering to help with last-minute details. I waved them off gently. "Just enjoy yourselves," I told them. "We'll all have plenty to talk about later." Emily bustled in and out, fussing over table settings. Daniel checked on the drinks, his phone never far from reach. I watched them both with a calm detachment, as though I were observing a play whose ending I already knew. As guests began to gather in the dining room, I placed the final dish on the table. Everything looked perfect: golden turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, my pies cooling on the counter. Emily ushered everyone to their seats, arranging the places with her usual precision. I found my name card again at the far end of the table. I smiled to myself. Let her think she was still in control. As the meal began, conversation flowed easily. Plates were passed, glasses filled. I participated where I could, nodding and smiling, laughing softly at the appropriate moments. But beneath the calm surface, I felt the steady weight of the envelope waiting upstairs. It wouldn't be opened yet. That moment would come later, after dessert, when the air was warm with satisfaction and no one expected a storm. For now, I played my part perfectly. The quiet, gracious mother, the accommodating guest, the woman who asked for nothing. Inside, though, I was counting the hours. This Thanksgiving, I wouldn't be the one served last. This Thanksgiving, I would be the one doing the serving. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the same crisp air and warm scents I'd always loved, but this year felt different. I moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, basting the turkey, checking the pies, arranging the table settings, just as I had done for decades. Emily didn't question my involvement this time. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. Daniel was quieter than usual, too, busying himself with drinks and greeting the guests as they arrived. Linda and Irene showed up early, helping in the kitchen. I caught Linda's eye once, and she gave me a subtle nod, as if to say she understood there was more to this day than just turkey and stuffing. The house filled with laughter and chatter. Emily busied herself managing the flow of guests, smiling broadly as she guided people to the dining room. Daniel made small talk, his phone in his pocket, his eyes darting toward Emily more often than usual. I kept my expression soft, my voice gentle. I was the picture of the quiet, grateful mother. No one could have guessed that, upstairs in my room, a sealed envelope sat in my handbag, waiting for the perfect moment. Dinner began just as it had the year before, but I could feel the subtle differences. My seat was once again at the far end of the table, but this time I didn't feel the same pang of disappointment. Instead, I smiled to myself. Let them believe they'd set the stage. They had no idea I was the one controlling the script. The food was served, the plates passed, and conversation bubbled around me. Emily beamed as guests complimented her cooking, though more than half the dishes had been prepared by my own hands. I didn't correct them. It didn't matter. I laughed at the appropriate moments, offered seconds when the serving bowls reached my end of the table, and stayed quiet when the talk turned to future plans and new opportunities. Every word they spoke sounded like confirmation of what I already knew. They thought this house was theirs to do with as they pleased. After the main course, dessert was brought out, my pies included, front and center this time. Guests praised them as the plates were served. I accepted the compliments with a gracious smile, though my thoughts were on the envelope in my bag. The room was warm, full of the comfortable hum that comes after a good meal. It was the perfect moment. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. Conversations quieted as I picked up my handbag from beside my chair. "I'd like to say a few words," I began, my voice calm but carrying across the room. Daniel looked at me, surprised. Emily's smile froze in place. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick, cream-colored envelope. "Last year, I was honored to be invited to your table," I said, looking toward Emily. "I was grateful to be here, even when I felt perhaps a little out of place. But this year, I thought it was time to bring something to the table that wasn't just food." I held the envelope in my hands for a moment, then opened it carefully. The rustle of paper filled the silent room as I unfolded the documents. "These," I said, lifting the top page, "are legal notices. As the sole owner of this house, I am formally notifying Daniel and Emily that their occupancy here will be ending in 30 days. Gasps rippled around the table. Linda's eyes widened. Irene's hand flew to her mouth. Emily's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice tight. Daniel blinked, stunned. "Mom, what is this?" I held his gaze, my voice steady. "It's the truth. The house you live in, the one you've been making plans for, belongs to me, and I think it's time we set some boundaries." Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked down at the papers, her hands trembling as she skimmed the lines. Daniel started to speak again, but I raised my hand. "I've heard enough over the past year, the phone calls, the whispers, the plans to sell what doesn't belong to you." I stayed quiet because I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, but it wasn't. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fireplace. Every eye was on us. I placed the documents in front of Emily, my movements deliberate. "You have 30 days to find another place to live. I'll give you both the dignity of time, but I won't continue to live as a guest in my own home." Emily's hands shook as she set the papers down. Daniel looked from her to me, his face pale, his jaw tight. I didn't look away. "I hope in time you understand this isn't about revenge. It's about respect, and it's long overdue." No one spoke. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and took a sip of coffee. Thanksgiving had just changed forever. The room hung in silence for a long moment after I sat back down. The only sound was the faint clink of a fork being set on a plate. Emily was the first to break it. "This is ridiculous," she burst out, her voice rising. "You can't just kick us out. We live here. This is our home." Her words were sharp, but I noticed her eyes dart briefly toward Linda and Irene, who were sitting in stunned silence. Emily's bravado faltered for a moment, but she pressed on. "Daniel, say something." Daniel was pale, his eyes still fixed on the stack of documents in front of Emily. His mouth open, then closed again. "Mom, I don't understand. Where is this coming from?" I held his gaze. It's coming from months of overheard conversations, hidden plans, and disrespect. It's coming from you making arrangements to sell a house that doesn't belong to you. It's coming from me finally deciding I won't live as a tolerated guest in my own home. Daniel flinched at my words. Emily shook her head, her voice cutting in. We were only trying to make things better for everyone. We wanted a bigger house, somewhere that could actually fit the whole family. Linda spoke for the first time, her voice calm but firm. Emily, I heard you at that charity event. You weren't talking about making space for Margaret. You were talking about getting this house for yourself. Emily's face flushed deep red. That's not what I meant. No one responded. The silence said everything. Daniel rubbed his forehead, his voice low. Mom, 30 days? That's not much time. The kids. I took a deep breath, my tone measured. Daniel, I'm giving you more time than you gave me when you decided this house wouldn't include me in your future. You have 30 days. That's the legal notice. But I paused, letting the tension settle before continuing. If you are willing to speak honestly and truly try to repair this, I will help you find a place. Not for Emily, for you, because you are still my son. The room was still. Emily's head snapped toward him. You're not actually considering this, are you? She's manipulating you. Daniel's voice was sharp, louder than I'd heard it in years. Emily, stop. Her mouth fell open. He turned back to me. His shoulders slumped. I don't know what to say, Mom. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I nodded slightly. Then use the 30 days to decide what you do mean, Daniel. You have a family to think about. But understand this. Your choices have consequences. You don't get to plan around me as though I'm invisible. Emily pushed back her chair, her voice trembling with anger. This is insane. I'm not going to sit here and let her humiliate us. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the dining room. The sound of her heels echoed down the hall. Daniel sat still for a moment, then quietly excused himself to check on her. The guests remained silent, the tension thick in the air. Linda reached across the table and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. You did what you had to do, Margaret. No one here doubts that. I offered her a small smile, though my chest felt heavy. I hadn't enjoyed delivering this blow, but sometimes the only way to protect what's yours is to make the hard choice. When Daniel returned, he looked tired, worn down. He didn't speak, just sat back in his chair, the papers still in front of him. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, the sound of liquid filling the silence. 30 days, Daniel, I said softly. I hope you use them well. He nodded faintly, not meeting my eyes. The rest of the evening moved on in uneasy quiet. Conversation returned in cautious waves, but the mood was forever changed. As guests began to leave, Linda hugged me tightly. You handled this with more grace than anyone else could have. That's strength, Margaret. Don't forget that. When the house was finally empty, I gathered the leftover dishes and pies, putting them away in the kitchen. Daniel and Emily's voices drifted faintly from the other room, low and tense. I didn't listen. I had said everything I needed to say. Upstairs, I placed my handbag back in its usual spot. The weight of the envelope was gone now, replaced by the quiet certainty that the balance of this household had shifted. This Thanksgiving, I had served more than just dinner. I had served the truth. 3 months had passed since that unforgettable Thanksgiving dinner, and the house that had once felt like a cage no longer belonged to my daily life. I now lived in a modest apartment on the second floor of a quiet brick building, just a few blocks from the park. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every plant on the windowsill, every book stacked neatly on the shelves. I could leave my knitting on the couch without anyone asking me to move it. I could watch my shows in the afternoon without checking the clock. I could cook dinner at whatever hour I pleased. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of ease when I walked into my home. There was no tension in the air, no undercurrent of whispers, just peace. I spent my mornings taking long walks, often stopping by a little cafe for coffee and a muffin. I became acquainted with a few neighbors, most of them retirees who enjoyed the same slower pace of life. Afternoons were filled with reading, gardening on the small balcony, or volunteering at the community center. My life was quiet, but it was full in ways I hadn't realized I was missing. Daniel reached out a few times. His calls were careful, tentative. The first time, he just wanted to see how I was settling in. I could hear the strain in his voice, the guilt he didn't quite know how to voice. "I'm doing well," I told him honestly. "Better than I have in years." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm glad to hear that, Mom." We didn't talk about Emily, and I didn't ask. Over the months, the calls became less awkward. Sometimes he brought the children by for short visits. They would run through my little apartment, delighted by the jar of cookies I kept just for them. I made sure those visits were warm, happy memories, no tension, no bitterness. Emily never called. She never visited. I didn't expect her to. Some bridges once burned aren't rebuilt, and that was fine. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I was looking for peace, and I'd already found it. In the time since I moved out, Daniel had found a rental home for his family. It was smaller than the old house, but from what I gathered, it was manageable for them. He didn't speak of his finances, and I didn't press. I had offered him help during the eviction, but he hadn't taken it. That was his choice. The most important thing was that boundaries were finally clear. The house I once lived in, my house, was now rented to a quiet couple in their 50s. Mr. Harris had handled the arrangements, ensuring everything was done properly. The rental income covered my new apartment's expenses and gave me enough to live comfortably. Sometimes I thought about the old house. I didn't miss it. What I missed were the illusions I had when I first moved in, the belief that I was returning to a warm, welcoming home, that my sacrifices would always be remembered. Those illusions were gone, and in their place was something stronger, clarity. I had learned the value of my own space, my own independence, and most importantly, my own worth. Linda and Irene visited often. They both admitted they hadn't expected me to go through with the eviction so calmly. "You didn't just make your point, Margaret," Irene said one afternoon over tea. "You changed the dynamic of the whole family. People know where you stand now." It was true. In the months since, I had felt a shift, not just with Daniel and Emily, but with other relatives. There was a new kind of respect in their voices when they spoke to me, a recognition that I wasn't someone to be quietly brushed aside. That recognition wasn't about power, it was about dignity. On quiet evenings, I would sit by my balcony, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sun set over the trees. The air was cool, the light fading, and I felt something I hadn't in years. Contentment. This new chapter of my life wasn't the one I had imagined, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The winter passed quietly in my new apartment, the air turning crisp outside while my little home stayed warm and welcoming. I filled the days with simple routines, morning walks to the cafe, afternoons spent reading, evenings curled up with a blanket and a cup of tea. But more than anything, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. When I first moved into Daniel and Emily's house, I had done so with the belief that family was unshakable. I thought that my years of sacrifice, late nights, long hours, the endless small acts of care, were investments that would be returned in love and respect. But what I learned was that family bonds are not maintained by history alone. They require constant care, and above all, mutual respect. Sitting at that Thanksgiving table, hearing my own son and his wife talk about my presence as convenient, was a moment that shattered something in me. But it also forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for too long. Respect cannot be assumed, even from those we love most. And when respect is absent, it is our responsibility to draw the line. I thought about the moments when I stayed silent, when my seat was moved to the far end of the table, when my pie was pushed aside, when the house rules seemed to shrink my presence a little more each day. At the time, I told myself I was keeping the peace. But what I was really doing was allowing myself to fade into the background of my own life. That decision to serve the eviction notice wasn't just about reclaiming my house, it was about reclaiming myself. In the months since, I've learned a great deal about boundaries. We teach people how to treat us by the standards we set. For years, I'd accepted less than I deserved because I didn't want to make waves, but silence can be mistaken for consent. And if we don't stand up for ourselves, we give others permission to continue as they are. Daniel calls me sometimes, and I can hear the change in his voice. There's a respect now that wasn't there before, not born of fear, but of understanding. He knows I will not allow myself to be diminished again. Emily hasn't spoken to me, and I'm at peace with that. I don't need her apology to validate my choices. My worth isn't determined by her acknowledgement or by anyone else's. I share this not to dwell on bitterness, but to offer something I wish I had learned earlier. Family, love, and loyalty are precious, but they are only sustainable when they rest on a foundation of respect. Respect is not just about politeness or kind words. It's about inclusion. It's about seeing someone as an equal partner in the family, not as a helper, a convenience, or an afterthought. Without that respect, love becomes conditional, and loyalty becomes transactional. I know my story is not unique. In the months since the eviction, I've spoken with other women at the community center, many of whom have faced similar experiences, moving in with adult children, only to find themselves treated more like tenants than family. Some have stayed silent. Others have quietly moved out. A few, like me, have had to take decisive action to reclaim their dignity. To those who may find themselves in that position, I would say this: you are allowed to expect respect. You are allowed to set boundaries, and you are allowed to protect your own peace, even if it means making difficult choices. There will be people who call it selfish. There will be people who don't understand. But the truth is, protecting your dignity is one of the most selfless things you can do, for yourself and for those who will learn from your example. I think often of my grandchildren. They don't understand everything that happened, but they see that I am happy, that I live in a place where I am comfortable and respected. One day, they will understand why I made the choices I did. And maybe, when they're adults, they'll remember that respect is not optional. It's essential. Life now is quieter, but it's also freer. My days are my own. I choose who I spend time with, how I arrange my home, what traditions I keep. The freedom I feel is not just about living alone. It's about knowing that I have the strength to stand up for myself no matter what. And so, as I sit here by my balcony, watching the sun dip low over the trees, I think back to the moment at that Thanksgiving table when I stood up with the envelope in my hand. It wasn't just a legal document I was delivering, it was a declaration. I will not be invisible in my own life. Tin tan chi ben ki kosu ton trong, nu kong, fai biet jung len cho shin min. That is the lesson I carry with me now, and I leave you, the listener, with a question. One I hope you will carry with you after hearing my story. If you were in my place, would you have the courage to do the same? Would you be willing to risk the discomfort, the criticism, the fracture in relationships to protect your dignity? It is not an easy choice, but it is one that can change everything, not just for you, but for the way others see you, and perhaps for the way they treat the next person in your place. My story may be over, but the lesson remains. Boundaries are not walls. They are bridges that ensure respect flows both ways, and without them, even the closest bonds will erode. As I close this chapter of my life, I do so with a heart that is lighter, a spirit that is stronger, and a peace that comes from knowing I chose myself. And I hope, if you ever find yourself where I once was, you will choose yourself too.